Aachen, October 1944. A cellar beneath a stone apartment block in the northwest of the city. A German rifleman of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division is pressed against the cold masonry wall, below street level, wrapped in the near-total safety that 10 feet of earth and brick had promised every defender since the fighting began. Above him, the building shudders. American artillery has been falling on this district for hours, and every impact sends grit sifting down from the ceiling joists. He does not flinch. He has learned, as every experienced German soldier in this city has learned, that the cellar is the one place the shells cannot reach. The old image of two armies trading fire across an open field has no bearing on how men survive here. Here you go underground, and underground you live. He has done everything German doctrine trained him to do. He is dug in below the fall of the shells. No infantry has rushed his position. No grenade has come down the stairwell. And then, without any of the things that were supposed to come first, a jet of burning fuel gouts through the narrow cellar window, and the air itself catches fire. His comrades, captured in the days that followed and questioned by First Army interrogators, said something that recurs across the intelligence summaries filed that autumn. They could not understand how the safest place in the city had become the deadliest. It is a strange complaint from men who had survived weeks of bombardment. They were not saying the Americans had hit them with something bigger. They were saying the Americans had reached them somewhere nothing was supposed to reach. That their shelter had worked exactly as designed against every weapon it was built to defeat, and they had been driven out or killed regardless. Weeks earlier, in the hedgerows and fortified villages of the frontier, the same German army, defending the same kind of ground with the same underground discipline, had bled the attacking formations badly. The cellars worked. The Germans were nearly untouchable beneath the streets, and for a time, the attackers paid for every block in a currency measured in dead riflemen. So why did the same defenders, fighting the same way in the same kind of stone city, stop being untouchable once a specific set of American tools arrived in the streets above them? The answer has almost nothing to do with the flamethrower alone, though the flamethrower is where the story is remembered. It has to do with a way of fighting inside cities that the United States Army had stitched together out of hard lessons and unglamorous equipment. A method built around a question the German defenders of Aachen had never been forced to answer. What do you do when the enemy stops trying to find you in your cellar and simply decides to make the cellar itself impossible to hold? The cellar deserves to be taken seriously because it is the easiest part of this story to underestimate. Aachen was an old city, and it was built like one. Its apartment blocks and civic buildings were raised from heavy stone and thick masonry, with basements that ran deep and walls that had stood for generations. When the Nazi regime turned the city into a fortress, those cellars became the backbone of the defense. German tactical doctrine, refined in the ruins of the Eastern Front, taught defenders to run the main line of resistance through the center of a town and to fight from the cellars and the upper floors at once. A soldier in a deep basement was shielded from the three weapons that dominated the battlefield of 1944. He was safe from artillery, whose fragments burst outward and upward and spent themselves against stone. He was safe from aerial bombing, which cratered streets and toppled facades, but rarely reached a man beneath a reinforced ceiling. And he was safe from rifle and machine gun fire, which could not turn corners or punch through a foundation wall. The official United States Army history of the campaign records this plainly. When the Americans opened their assault on the city with hundreds of fighter bombers and tens of thousands of artillery rounds, seasoned observers could hardly have hoped for much more than a psychological effect, because the Germans had such good cover in the thick-walled buildings and cellars. The bombardment made rubble. It did not make many corpses. Men who lived through it climbed back to their firing positions and found the enemy still coming. In a purely defensive sense, the cellar was one of the most effective pieces of military engineering in the entire war, and it cost almost nothing, because it was already there. Every street in Aachen was lined with them. A defending division did not need to dig fortifications. It needed only to move downstairs. There is a reason the German soldier trusted the cellar so completely, and it was not blind faith. It was experience. For most of the war, The man who got below ground and stayed there had lived. On the Eastern Front, where German infantry had learned the brutal arithmetic of city fighting in places like the ruined factory districts along the Volga, the cellar had been the difference between survival and death under bombardment. Soviet and German soldiers alike had burrowed into basements and sewers and had found that even the heaviest shelling passed over them. The lesson had been paid for in enormous quantities of blood, and it had been learned. When those same veterans, or men trained by them, arrived to defend a German city in the autumn of 1944, they carried that lesson with them. Get deep enough, put enough masonry overhead, and the storm outside could not touch you. It was one of the few certainties left to a soldier in a war Germany was plainly losing, and at Aachen, right up until the Americans arrived, that certainty was still true. The problem was never that the cellar stopped protecting the man from what it had always protected him from. The problem was that the Americans stopped attacking him with the things the cellar defeated. If forgotten mechanics like this one interest you, the real reasons a battle turned rather than the famous names, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this kind of history reach more people who care about getting it right. To understand why the cellar failed, you first have to understand the city that Aachen was, and why two armies were willing to destroy it for ground that had almost no military value. Aachen sits at the western edge of Germany, the first major German city in the path of the American advance toward the Ruhr, the industrial heart the Allies most wanted to reach. It was not a center of war production. It made very little that mattered to the German war effort. By any cold calculation of tanks and factories, it could have been bypassed. What made Aachen worth a battle was its meaning. This was the city of Charlemagne. He had made it the seat of his empire, and he was buried there in the year 814. His chapel formed the core of the cathedral, and from the 10th century into the 16th, more than 30 German kings were crowned within its walls. Nazi propaganda had wrapped itself in that inheritance, casting Charlemagne's realm as a first German empire and Hitler's state as the third. To surrender the coronation city of the old emperors without a fight was politically unthinkable. Hitler ordered the city held to the last. Through the German High Command, the order was reinforced in the final week. The garrison commander was to hold this venerable German city to the last man, and if necessary to let himself be buried beneath its ruins. The road to that final stand had been long and slow, and it is worth understanding why. The Americans had first reached the German frontier near Aachen in the second week of September. The 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red one, closed up to the western outskirts of the city, and General Hodges, commanding the First Army, faced a choice. He could batter his way straight into a defended city, which promised heavy casualties, or he could swing around it, close a ring, and let an isolated garrison see reason. He chose the ring. The plan was to encircle Aachen with two arms, the 1st Infantry Division curling up from the south, and the 30th Infantry Division driving down across the Würm River from the north, until the two met behind the city and sealed it off. Then the whole effort stalled, and the reason lay far to the north. In the middle of September, the Allies launched Operation Market Garden, the great airborne thrust into the Netherlands, and that operation swallowed fuel, ammunition, and priority. The long supply lines stretching all the way back from the Normandy beaches could not feed everything at once, and the First Army at Aachen found itself starved. Fuel became so critical that entire operations ground to a halt. As one American commander put it plainly, quite literally all action became foot action. The pause was a gift to the defenders. It gave the Germans time to feed reinforcements into the belts of concrete fortifications, the pillboxes and dragon's teeth of the Siegfried Line that ringed the city on both sides. Every day the Americans could not move was a day the Germans used to make the eventual assault more expensive. There was also a strange, revealing episode in those first September days that shows how close Aachen came to a different fate. When the Americans first appeared, the defense of the city fell for a moment to Lieutenant General Gerhard von Schwerin, commander of the 116th Panzer Division. Von Schwerin was a professional soldier who could read a hopeless situation. With American troops seemingly about to enter the city, He halted a chaotic civilian evacuation, judging it better that Aachen's people stay put and be looked after by the Americans than die on choked roads. And he wrote a letter, addressed to the commander of the American forces, effectively offering to hand the city over rather than see it destroyed. But the tactical situation shifted before the letter could be delivered. Von Schwerin was ordered to counterattack instead, and he sent an officer to retrieve the letter from where it had been left. It was too late. The letter had already fallen into German hands. To the Nazi authorities it read as treason. Von Schwerin was relieved of his command and placed under arrest, facing a charge that could have cost him his life. Only the intervention of senior field marshals spared him serious punishment. The message of the episode was clear to every German officer who heard about it. There would be no quiet surrender of Aachen. The city would be held, whatever the cost to the men inside it, and to the civilians the fighting would trap. For much of September and into October, the two American pincers pushed slowly toward each other through the fortified suburbs, and the Germans fought hard to keep the gap between them open. Before the final assault on the city itself, the Americans made one formal attempt to end it without a street battle. On the 10th of October, 3 Americans walked toward the German lines along the Trierer Strasse under a white flag, carrying a written ultimatum. Their names were First Lieutenant Cedric Lafley, First Lieutenant William Boehm, and Private First Class Ken Kading. The document they carried promised the complete destruction of the city if it was not surrendered unconditionally within 24 hours. At that moment, the military commander in Aachen was not Wilk, but Colonel Leher, one of the regimental commanders of the 246th Division. Bound by Hitler's order, Leher rejected the ultimatum. When the deadline passed, the Americans made good on the threat. On the 11th of October, waves of fighter bombers, something like 300 aircraft, worked over the city and dropped more than 60 tons of bombs, while 12 battalions of artillery hammered it, the division guns firing around 2,500 rounds, and the corps guns firing well over 2,000 more. The next day the fighter bombers came again and dropped nearly 100 tons of bombs, and the artillery poured in 5,000 rounds. It was an extraordinary weight of fire aimed at a single city, and when the infantry moved in behind it, they discovered what the official history would later record without flinching. For all that fury, the defenders in their cellars and thick-walled buildings had barely been touched. The bombardment had made a landscape of rubble, and the men who were supposed to be dead beneath it climbed back up and manned their guns. While the city itself was being pounded, the ring was still being forged in the fortified ground around it. And one action on that ground deserves to be remembered, because it shows the kind of fighting it took just to reach Aachen. On the 8th of October, on a piece of high ground called Crucifix Hill, Captain Bobby Brown of Company C of the 18th Infantry led an assault against a belt of concrete pillboxes that anchored the German line. When the advance stalled against bunkers that rifle fire could not touch, Brown took a pole charge, a long shaft tipped with explosive, and went at the pillboxes himself. He crossed open ground swept by fire, again and again, planting charges against the embrasures and the doors to blow them open one by one. He was wounded, first by a mortar shell, and then twice more as he crawled forward to scout the next positions, and he refused to leave until the hill was taken. For that day's work he received the Medal of Honor. Crucifix Hill was one hill among many, and Bobby Brown was one man among thousands. But his fight is a reminder that the encirclement of Aachen was not a clean line drawn on a map. It was paid for pillbox by pillbox, in blood, by men doing things that should not have been survivable. The two pincers finally met on the 16th of October, near the town of Würselen, where patrols from the 1st and 30th Divisions made contact and closed the ring around the city. The gap between the two American forces had at one point narrowed to a corridor only a mile or two wide, and through that narrow throat, the Germans poured everything they had to keep it open, because they understood exactly what its closing would mean. When the two divisions finally shook hands near Würselen, the garrison inside Aachen was cut off from resupply, from reinforcement, and from any hope of orderly retreat. Even then the seal was not perfect. The Germans launched furious counterattacks to break back through and reopen a corridor. The relief effort was carried by the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division and by von Schwerin's old formation, the 116th Panzer Division, and they struck at the American Ring on the 15th, the 18th, and the 19th of October. These were not weak formations on paper. They were mobile divisions with armor, the kind of force that earlier in the war might have torn an encirclement open. But the attacks came in piecemeal, thrown in as they arrived, rather than massed for a single decisive blow, and without the coordination that German commanders had once made their trademark. And they ran into the one thing the German army in the West could no longer match: American artillery, dense and superbly directed, and American air power, able to range over the battlefield almost at will, broke them up before they could achieve a breakthrough. Each attack was smashed short of its objective. No relief reached the garrison. Aachen was on its own, and every man inside it now knew it. Inside the shrinking perimeter, conditions for the defenders grew steadily worse. Food and water ran short. Ammunition had to be hoarded. The wounded piled up in the same cellars where the fighting men sheltered, with dwindling means to treat them. And crowded into those same basements and the great public air raid shelters were thousands of civilians, the remnant of the city's population who had not been evacuated, trapped now between the German soldiers who would not surrender and the American assault that was grinding toward them block by block. This was the human reality beneath the tactical story. When the Americans finally reached a cellar and offered its occupants the choice between coming out and being burned out, the people making that choice were very often not only soldiers but frightened families who had been sheltering in the dark for days, listening to the battle come closer. The mixing of soldiers and civilians in the same underground spaces made the fighting slower, harder, and more terrible, and it is part of why the American method leaned so heavily on driving defenders out rather than simply killing everything below ground. The final stand fell to a colonel named Gerhard Wilk, commander of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division, who took charge inside the city as the fighting reached the streets. His garrison was a patchwork. It was built around perhaps 5,000 men in the inner defenses, most from his own division, stiffened by odd fortress units, a company and more of city policemen, and Luftwaffe ground troops. His division itself was under strength, filled out with survivors of formations that had already been shattered further west. He had almost no armor inside the city, no more than a handful of tanks by the American reckoning, and a modest collection of field guns and howitzers. Against him, the United States First Army committed the 1st Infantry Division, one of the most experienced formations in the American Army. The task of taking the city itself fell to a single regiment, the 26th Infantry, under Colonel John Seitz, and within that regiment to just 2 battalions, because a 3rd had been detached. 2 battalions of American infantry, roughly 2,000 men, would go into a fortress city defended by more than twice their number, and they would take it in 9 days. They could do that because of how they chose to fight, and the choice was deliberate. The 2 battalion commanders became the 2 faces of a single method. The 2nd Battalion was led by Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Daniel, and his sector was the dense, built-up heart of the city. Daniel understood exactly what he was facing, and he built his plan around it. He would not try to outshoot defenders who could not be seen. He would make it impossible for them to remain where they hid. His concept ran in 3 parts. First, he would seal his slice of the city off with artillery and mortar fire, ringing his sector with a curtain of shells so that Germans could neither slip reinforcements in nor pull their men out. This isolation was more important than it sounds. A defender who knows he cannot be reinforced and cannot retreat is fighting a different battle from one who believes help is coming. And a sector sealed by fire could be reduced at leisure, block by block, without fresh enemy troops appearing in the cleared areas behind the advance. Second, he would use direct fire from tanks, from tank destroyers, and from heavy machine guns to pin the defenders in place and chase them down into their cellars. This was the step that set up everything else. The point of the direct fire was not mainly to kill. It was to make the ground floors and the upper floors unlivable, so that the German soldier's own survival instinct did the Americans a favor and drove him underground. into the one part of the building the assault teams could most easily isolate and control. Third, once they were driven underground, his riflemen would come in close with grenades and with bayonets and with flame, and finish the job at arm's length, in the cellars where the defenders had gone to be safe. He gave the whole idea a blunt name that stuck: knock them all down. His reasoning was as plain as the phrase. The defenders could hardly deliver accurate fire with the buildings falling down around their ears. The 3rd Battalion was led by Lieutenant Colonel John Corley, and his sector ran toward the high ground on the city's northern edge, the parks and the hotels and the wooded hills that overlooked everything below. Corley's fight would carry him up through a factory district and on toward Farwick Park, toward a grand hotel called the Quellenhof, and toward the heights of the Lousberg, the observatory hill that dominated the city. His men fought, as one account put it, from attic to attic and from sewer to sewer. Where Daniel ground methodically through blocks of apartments, Corley drove for the commanding hills. 2 different problems, 2 different men, one shared doctrine underneath. And that shared doctrine is the thing that actually broke the Cellars, because the flamethrower was only ever the last step in a sequence, and the sequence is where the killing power lived. Corley's men learned early how stubborn the German construction could be. In the factory district, his lead company came upon a foundry whose walls had been reinforced with sheets of tank armor, a building that simply laughed at tank rounds. There was one soldier in that fighting whose story survives because of what he did when the plan broke down. On the 13th of October, on a street called the Jülicher Straße, German cannon fire drove the attacking riflemen back and knocked out 2 of the American tanks supporting them, one of them left burning. A squad leader named Sergeant Alvin Wise ran through that fire to the other disabled tank to get its wounded crew out. Then he climbed aboard and used the tank's own machine guns to spray the German-held buildings and cover his men. And then, although neither he nor the 2 soldiers who joined him had ever been inside a tank in their lives, they worked out how to start the engine, turned the machine around, and drove it back out of the fire to safety. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for it. His improvisation is a small window into the texture of this fight. It was not a battle of grand maneuver, it was a battle of individual buildings and individual streets, won by men solving one lethal problem at a time. Picture what an American assault on a single building actually looked like, because the mechanics matter more than the drama. Daniel organized each of his rifle companies into a small, self-contained team, mixing weapons that normally lived apart. A company going into the attack might have 3 tanks, or tank destroyers, a pair of towed anti-tank guns, extra bazooka teams, heavy machine guns, and a single 2-man flamethrower crew. Nothing about this advance waited for a confirmed target. The Americans assumed every building in front of them was defended until they had proven otherwise. A tank or a tank destroyer would pull up and hold a building under fire, working it over, while the infantry got into position. The gunners had a refinement that made Cellars specifically untenable. They fired explosive shells fitted with delayed fuses, so that a round would punch through a wall or a floor and then detonate inside, a room or a story deep, rather than bursting harmlessly on the surface. The effect was that a German could not simply stay in the building and wait out the storm. The storm was now going off inside the walls with him. That relentless direct fire did exactly what Daniel intended. It drove the defenders down into the cellars, and then the infantry came. Getting to the next building was its own problem, because the streets of Aachen were killing grounds. German anti-tank guns and machine guns were laid along the avenues, waiting for anything that stepped into the open, so the Americans learned to stay out of the street entirely. They blew holes through the interior walls of adjoining buildings, using explosives, shaped charges, bazookas, and tank fire, and they moved from house to house through those holes without ever exposing themselves to the open lanes. The technique had a name that captured it exactly: mouse-holing. In the western part of the city, Daniel's men found it safer and faster to advance by punching mouse holes through the thin basement walls of neighboring buildings or by slipping through backyards than to risk a single stride down a swept street. The war in Aachen was fought sideways, through walls, below the notice of the guns aimed at the roads. Even the ground beneath the city became a battlefield. Aachen's defenders used the storm sewer network to travel unseen and to emerge behind the advancing Americans, popping up in blocks that had already been cleared. The answer was grim and methodical. Every manhole had to be found, blocked, covered, and weighed down. Soldiers of one company dropped grenades into the utility holes, forced the covers back into place, and stacked heavy objects on top so that no one could lift them from below. Clearing a block did not mean clearing the buildings on it. It meant clearing the buildings, the cellars beneath them, the attics above them, and the tunnels under the street, all at once, and then making sure the enemy could not seep back in from any of those directions. Daniel's control of his battalion was a study in discipline, and the discipline was what made the method work. He worked from meticulously numbered maps that marked every intersection and every prominent building, so that a platoon leader could report his exact position with a single number rather than a vague description, and so that supporting fire could be shifted precisely from one labeled building to the next. The rule at the heart of it was absolute. No unit pushed past its assigned checkpoint until it had made physical contact with the units on both its flanks. This sounds simple. In the chaos of a burning city, with visibility measured in yards and every block a maze, it was extraordinarily hard, and it was the single thing that kept the assault from coming apart. An advance that outran its neighbors created a gap, and a gap was an invitation for the Germans to filter back in behind the leading troops and cut them off. So the battalion moved as a connected line, no faster than its slowest part, refusing to let ambition open a hole in its own front. Thoroughness mattered more than speed. Daniel understood that a block cleared quickly but imperfectly would have to be cleared again, at greater cost, when the enemy reappeared in its cellars. So his men cleared it once, completely. It took the 2nd Battalion roughly 9 days to grind through the downtown, searching every building, every room, every closet, every cellar, and every manhole as it went. 9 days to cross a distance a man could have walked in 20 minutes on a peaceful afternoon. That ratio is the truest measure of what city fighting cost. This is the machine into which the flamethrower was fed, and understanding the machine is the whole point, because the flamethrower did not work in isolation. It worked because the entire American system had already stripped the cellar of every advantage it once held. The bombardment could not touch the man underground, true, but the bombardment was never meant to kill him. It was meant to strip away the building above him and keep his head down while the assault teams closed in. The direct fire with delayed fuses drove him below ground and made the floors above him uninhabitable. The mouse-holing meant the Americans arrived at the mouth of his cellar without ever crossing the street he had covered with his machine gun, and once they were there, at the top of his stairs, with him sealed in the one place he had trusted, the whole geometry of his safety inverted. The cellar had only one way out, and the Americans were standing in it. Now the flamethrower, and it is worth being precise about what it actually was, because the popular memory of Aachen tends to inflate it. There were no flame-throwing tanks rolling through the city. The weapon used in Aachen was the man-portable backpack flamethrower, carried and fired by a 2-man team, with one such team attached to each rifle company headquarters. It held about 4 gallons of fuel. Its effective reach was short, on the order of 20 yards, perhaps up to 40 with thickened fuel, and it could sustain flame for only a matter of seconds, roughly 7 to 8 at a time. It was ignited by a small cartridge system in the nozzle, a revolving igniter that fired a fresh cartridge for each burst, and even that did not always work when it was needed. The whole rig, filled, weighed close to 70 pounds. Think about what that meant for the man who carried it. He was a soldier lugging almost 70 pounds of fuel and pressurized gas on his back, through streets swept by machine gun fire, and everyone on the other side wanted him dead more than they wanted anyone else dead, because they knew what he carried. To use his weapon he had to get close, closer than a man with a rifle would ever willingly go, to within 20 yards or so of a defended position, and then stand up and expose himself long enough to aim and fire. A single bullet in the fuel tanks could turn him into a torch. His burst lasted only seconds, and then he was a man with an empty tank and a target painted on him. This was among the most dangerous jobs in the infantry, and the two-man team existed partly so that a second soldier could help manage and protect the operator. It is worth holding that image in mind, because it corrects the easy assumption that the flamethrower made the fighting one-sided. It did not. It made a terrible weapon available to men who had to risk almost everything to bring it to bear. The official history is careful about how it was used. When the shelling and the grenades were not enough, when the enemy proved particularly stubborn, the riflemen turned to the other tools they carried, including demolitions and the flamethrowers worked by those two-man teams. The flame was not the opening move. It was the closing argument, brought forward against the positions that refused every other persuasion. It was expensive to use in risk to the operator, short in duration, and limited in reach, and for all those reasons it was held back until nothing else would serve. And then, against the right target, it did what nothing else could. And against the cellar, and against the great concrete air raid shelters that studded the city, flame was uniquely persuasive, for reasons that went well beyond simple burning. Consider the single best documented flame incident of the entire battle, recorded by Daniel himself. On the 15th of October, one of his companies, G Company, came up against an enormous structure, a hulking air raid shelter, with concrete walls so thick that the men first took it for a colossal blockhouse. Tank and tank destroyer rounds would not crack it. The infantry drove the defenders inside and sealed the doors by sweeping them with machine gun fire, and then, through an interpreter, demanded surrender. Silence answered. So the company commander called up a flamethrower, and here the story turns on a small, human, almost absurd detail. The flamethrower would not light. The operator worked at it and could not get a flame. The company commander pulled out a box of matches, fumbled several, and finally lit the weapon by hand, and sent a single jet of fire through a door that appeared to be closed only by baffles. The reaction inside was immediate. A German officer came out to talk terms. Told to surrender or be burned out, the shelter gave up around 200 soldiers and more than 1,000 civilians who had been sheltering inside. Inspection afterward showed a 3-story air raid shelter with walls about 15 feet thick. One squirt of flame, lit by a match, emptied a fortress that shells could not crack. That story explains why flame defeated the cellar in a way that raw physics only partly captures. Part of the answer is physical, and it is genuinely lethal. When burning fuel is thrown into an enclosed underground space, it does more than set men alight. It consumes the oxygen in the room, and it fills the space with carbon monoxide and other toxic gases. Studies of flame weapons used against enclosed fortifications found that the oxygen in a sealed position could be driven down long enough to cause near-instant unconsciousness, and that poisonous gas could linger at deadly levels for many minutes afterward. A defender in a cellar did not need to be touched by the flame to die. He could suffocate as the fire ate the air. He could be poisoned by the gas the fire left behind. He could be killed by superheated air searing his lungs. And crucially, he could not run, because the single entrance to his shelter was exactly where the flame was coming from, and it was covered by the men holding it. Every quality that had made the cellar safe against shells made it a sealed trap against fire. This was the cruel logic that the enclosed space imposed. In the open, a flamethrower is a short-ranged and rather limited weapon, easily avoided by a man who simply stays beyond its reach. Its terrible efficiency appears only when the target cannot get away, and a cellar is the purest possible example of a place a man cannot get away from. The very depth and solidity that sealed out the shells now sealed in the fire and its aftermath. The thick walls that had shrugged off bombs now held the heat and the poisoned air like an oven. The single reinforced entrance that had been a strength, one way in for the enemy to be shot as he came, became a single point through which death could be introduced, and past which no one could escape. The cellar had been designed, in effect, to be a sealed box that kept danger out. Against flame, it became a sealed box that kept danger in. Nothing about the cellar had changed. Only the direction of the threat had reversed, and the same features that had meant safety now meant the opposite. But the deeper part of the answer, The part the Aachen record shows again and again is psychological. Flame is the oldest terror there is, and men who would stand fast under artillery and rifle fire would not stand against it. The 200 soldiers who poured out of that shelter were not burned. They surrendered at the threat, at a single jet of fire through a doorway, because a cellar that had felt like protection now felt like an oven with one door, and the enemy owned the door. The American method did not so much kill the defenders in their cellars as make the cellar unbearable to occupy. It converted the safest space in the city into the most frightening, and it did so with a weapon that most of the time did its work by the promise of what it could do rather than by doing it. Across 9 days of fighting, Daniel's battalion used only about 50 gallons of flamethrower fuel, a tiny quantity beside the thousands of shells and the tens of thousands of bullets it expended. The flamethrower's importance was never in its volume. It was in what it could do that nothing else could, and in what men believed it would do to them. This inversion, the safe place made deadly, is the true subject of the battle, and it played out across the city in the hardest fighting of the 9 days. On the high ground in Corley's sector, the struggle centered on Fahrig Park and the grand hotel called the Quellenhof, where the defenders included some of the toughest men in the garrison. In the middle of the battle, a battalion drawn from the 1st SS Panzer Division had infiltrated into the city to reinforce Wilk, a group of perhaps 150 men with a few tanks and assault guns, and it counterattacked here. The park changed hands, and the fight for the hotel became savage. The Quellenhof itself became a vertical version of the same cellar problem. On the 18th of October, a young officer named 2nd Lieutenant William Ratchford led his platoon into the lobby and cleared it while the Germans pulled down into the basement to escape the shelling, exactly as doctrine told them to. Grenade duels broke out at every entrance to that basement. The fight ended only when Ratchford got machine guns firing down into the cellar, at which point the defenders gave up. 25 of them had died below ground. A search of the hotel afterward turned up large caches of food and ammunition, and, up on the 2nd floor, an anti-aircraft gun the Germans had carried upstairs piece by piece, reassembled, and mounted to fire out into the park. Even in a luxury hotel, the story was the same. The Germans went down to the cellar for safety, and the cellar became the place where they were cornered. When the older buildings and the concrete shelters proved too strong even for tanks, the Americans reached for something heavier, and it is one of the signature images of the battle. On the first day of the city fight, Corley found buildings that shrugged off his tank fire, and he called for a self-propelled 155mm gun, an enormous weapon on a tracked chassis, built to smash fortifications. It came from an artillery battery that had been pushed right up to the front to fire straight down the streets. Early the next morning it went to work, and a single shell practically leveled one of the sturdy buildings that had defied everything else. Seitz was impressed enough that he arranged for one of these guns for each battalion. Its crews had nicknames for it, born of respect for what it could do. It could punch through several feet of reinforced concrete with a single round. Daniel used his with particular ingenuity. On one occasion he had a tank destroyer knock a hole in a wall to open a firing lane, then brought the great gun up and put a dozen rounds through the gap into what turned out to be a German tank on the far side, destroying it, and then destroyed a second tank soon after. On another day, one of his companies used the gun to bring down a church steeple where a sniper team was hiding, with a single shot. This was the logic of knock them all down carried to its conclusion. If a position was too strong to enter, you did not enter it. You removed the building around it. Step back and the shape of the American method becomes clear, and it is a shape the German defenders had no answer to, because it did not attack their strength. It made their strength irrelevant. German doctrine, and the German soldiers' whole understanding of survival in a city, rested on a simple and reasonable proposition. Get below ground, behind enough stone, and the enemy's firepower cannot reach you. Wait out the storm, then come up and fight. That proposition had been true for most of the war. It was still true, in a narrow sense, at Aachen. The shells really could not reach the man in the deep cellar, but the Americans had stopped trying to reach him with shells. They had built a method that did not need to kill the defender where he sheltered. It needed only to make sheltering impossible. Drive him down with direct fire. Come to his door through the walls, not the street. Seal him in, and then present him with a choice between surrender and a weapon against which his shelter offered no protection at all. The German was not beaten in the contest he had trained for. He was removed from it. There is a genuine asymmetry of ideas underneath this, and it is worth naming carefully. The German approach to city fighting was built on the strength and initiative of the individual position and the individual leader. It produced ferociously effective local defense, small groups of determined men holding strongpoints far longer than their numbers should have allowed. The American approach, by contrast, treated the assault as a system, a coordinated combination of arms in which no single weapon had to be decisive because the combination was. The tank did not have to kill the defender, it only had to drive him down to where the flamethrower waited. The flamethrower did not have to burn him, it only had to make the cellar a place no one would stay. The artillery did not have to reach the basement. It only had to keep heads down while the assault teams crossed the last stretch of ground through the walls. Each piece covered the weakness of the others. The German defender, expert in his own strongpoint, found himself facing not a better strongpoint, but an integrated procedure that made strongpoints pointless. He kept winning the argument he knew how to have, and losing the battle anyway. The cooperation between the tanks and the infantry was the beating heart of that system, and it did not come naturally. Armor and foot soldiers had often mistrusted each other earlier in the war. Tankers feared the close confines of a city, where a hidden soldier with a shaped charge or a handheld rocket could kill a tank from a doorway, and where the machine's great strengths, its speed and its long-range guns, counted for little. Infantry feared advancing beside a tank because the tank drew fire onto everyone around it. At Aachen, the two arms learned to need each other. The infantry protected the tank, walking ahead and beside it, watching the windows and the doorways and the cellar mouths that the tank crew, buttoned up and half-blind inside their armor, could not see. In return, the tank was the infantry's battering ram and its shield, smashing open the buildings and standing between the riflemen and the German guns. A telephone was often rigged to the rear of each tank, so that a soldier on foot could talk directly to the crew inside without exposing himself, pointing them at a target the crew had no way of spotting. It was an intimate, dangerous partnership, worked out in the streets under fire, and it multiplied the power of both. A German strongpoint that could have held off infantry alone or shrugged off a tank alone came apart when the two worked together, each covering exactly the blind spot the other could not. What the Germans lacked was not courage and not skill. It was this integration, running all the way down to the smallest unit, delivered as routine, rather than improvised in the moment. American doctrine had spent the interwar years and the campaigns before Aachen learning to fight as a combined machine, and by the autumn of 1944, that machine was running smoothly in the hands of a veteran division. The German defender, for all his individual excellence, was a superb part of a system that no longer functioned around him. His artillery was good, but could not answer fast enough. His armor was scarce and could not move freely in the ruins. His command was cut off and starving. He was, in the end, a first-rate soldier fighting alone inside a method that had been designed to make his aloneness fatal. The engineers who supported the assault added their own inventions to the method, and some of them were almost gleeful in their improvisation. In one of the stranger episodes of the battle, an engineer group loaded a captured Aachen streetcar with explosives and a time fuse, towed it to the crest of a hill, and sent it careening down the trolley tracks into the German-held part of the city, a kind of improvised rolling bomb they dubbed with a joking name. The first one blew up too early. A second ground to a halt against the wreckage of the first. After patrols had cleared the track, the engineers tried a third time, and that one reached the city proper before it exploded. Whether it did any real damage almost did not matter. The official history records the episode less as a serious tactic than as an expression of the engineers' delight in the problem itself. But the underlying attitude is the point. These were men who treated every obstacle as a puzzle to be solved with whatever was at hand, and who assumed there was always a way to make a position untenable if you thought about it hard enough. That attitude, more than any single weapon, is what the German defender was really up against. By the 20th of October, the garrison was collapsing into a shrinking pocket in the northwest of the city. Wilk had moved his command post into a large air raid bunker on the slope of the Lousberg near the Technical University, and from there he sent a stream of increasingly theatrical radio messages to higher command, declaring that the last defenders of Aachen were locked in their final battle, even reporting a donation to the Winter Relief Fund and signing off with a cry of loyalty to the Führer. The reality on the ground was that Corley's men were closing on his bunker, and Corley had called forward the one weapon Wilk most feared, the self-propelled 155mm gun that had leveled buildings across the city. Wilk understood what that gun would do to his shelter. He decided to surrender, but there was a final complication that captured the whole nature of this fight. 2 German soldiers who tried to step out of the bunker under a white flag were shot down in the confusion of the streets, because in this kind of fighting, no one could be sure a surrender was real. The deadlock was broken by 2 American prisoners the Germans were holding, 2 engineers named Staff Sergeant Ewart Paget and Private First Class James Haswell, who had been captured outside the city days earlier. They volunteered to walk out under the white flag themselves and arrange the surrender that their own captured comrades could safely accept. At 5 minutes past noon on the 21st of October 1944, the Assistant Division Commander, Brigadier General George Taylor, accepted Colonel Wilk's surrender. The first major German city in the path of the Allies had fallen, and it had fallen not to a single wonder weapon, but to a patient, coordinated method that had made every hiding place in it untenable in turn. The cost tells its own story about what kind of fighting this was. The 2 battalions of the 26th Infantry that took the city lost about 500 men, 75 of them killed, a hard toll for 2,000 men in 9 days, but a remarkably contained one for the seizure of a fortress city held by a larger force. The 1st Infantry Division as a whole took more than 5,000 prisoners over the course of the operation, several thousand of them inside the city itself, and the 30th Division, fighting the northern half of the battle, took some 6,000 more. The relatively light losses in the city fight itself are worth pausing on, because they are the clearest possible verdict on the method. 2 American battalions took a fortress city defended by a larger force in 9 days, and lost a fraction of the men that a frontal, see the enemy and shoot him style of assault would have cost. The reason was precisely that they refused to fight the battle the Germans were prepared for. They did not send riflemen charging into rooms full of hidden defenders. They knocked the rooms down first, drove the defenders underground, and dealt with them there on American terms. The city itself paid the price for that approach, and the price was near total. By the time it fell, something like 80% or more of Aachen's buildings had been destroyed or damaged. The coronation city of Charlemagne, one of the oldest and most storied places in Germany, had been reduced across a few weeks to a landscape of rubble and standing husks. Of a pre-war population of around 165,000, fewer than 20,000 remained when the guns stopped, and most of those were gathered up and evacuated by American military government teams to a quieter suburb, where the long work of feeding and housing them began. Aachen thus became not only the first great German city the Western Allies captured, but the first place they had to govern, the first test of what it would mean to occupy and administer a defeated Germany city by city. That test lay in the future. In late October, it was simply a ruin full of prisoners and frightened people. Wilk, taken into captivity, was branded a traitor by the Nazi authorities for surrendering the coronation city. German propaganda produced a leaflet carrying his picture and the words declaring that he bore the guilt, blaming him for the city's destruction and for giving up a place Hitler had ordered held to the last man. It was a grotesque charge. Wilk had held on until his men were out of the means to fight, until his ammunition and food and water were gone and no relief could reach him, and he had surrendered rather than see the last of them and the civilians around them die for nothing. But the charge tells you what the regime demanded, and it tells you the trap that every senior German officer at Aachen was caught in. He had, in the end, done what the German soldier in the cellar had done. He had trusted the protection of stone and concrete, and he had discovered that against this particular enemy, stone and concrete only delayed the moment when he had to choose between surrender and destruction. Here is the verdict the battle actually renders, and it is not the one the title alone would suggest. The German rifleman in his cellar did not fail. His shelter did not fail. His doctrine did not fail on its own terms. The deep basement remained, to the last day, genuinely proof against artillery and bombs and bullets, exactly as it had always been. What failed was the assumption underneath it, the belief that being unreachable by the enemy's firepower was the same as being safe. The Germans had built their entire understanding of urban defense on the idea that if the shells could not reach you, you would live. The Americans simply declined to accept the terms of that idea. They did not try to reach the man in the cellar with a bigger shell. They built a method that made his cellar a cage, drove him into it, came to its one door through the walls of the city, and then offered him fire. The flamethrower is remembered as the weapon that took the cellars of Aachen, and in the final instant it often was. But it could only be the last step, because a dozen other unglamorous things, delayed fuses and mouse holes and sealed manholes and numbered maps, and a monstrous gun on a tank chassis, had already stripped the cellar of everything that made it a refuge. The German defender died or surrendered without fully understanding what had beaten him, because the framework he had trained inside did not contain the possibility. In his model of war, safety was a place. Find the right place, put enough stone between yourself and the enemy, and you were beyond his reach. The American model did not recognize safe places. It recognized only positions that had not yet been made untenable, and it carried the tools to make any position untenable in turn. Both ways of thinking were coherent. Both had been forged in real combat by professional soldiers who knew their trade. Only one of them matched the conditions in the streets of Aachen in October of 1944, where the safest cellar in the city and the deadliest turned out, in the end, to be the very same room. If this account gave you something to think about, a like helps it reach more people, and subscribing means you will not miss the next deep dive into the parts of this war that rarely make it into the standard histories.